Clapperboard, you're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled The War of Silent Stars. Father, I'll marry anyone except the human. The Alien Princess HFY sci-fi short stories. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now we begin. They called it the Year of Quiet Skies. From the Perseus arm to the rim of the Saffron Drift, beacons winked out like candles slipped under a glass. Trade routes were suddenly blind. Patrols went missing, then whole fleets. Transmissions dissolved into a hush that was not empty, not natural. It had texture like velvet pressed against a mouth. Humans had a name for it by the third week, the silence. No one knew what it was at first. Anomalous dust, vandalized maser arrays, a hacker god pressing mute on reality. But engineers swore their boards were clean. Navigators cursed at stubborn coordinates, and admirals stared at navigational charts suddenly full of dead lights. The Dominion of Valor felt it worst. They had grown beautiful and complacent beneath vaults of sapphire. Palace cruisers gleamed like knives. They measured time with the pulse of their beacon chains, each relay a proud pillar of history. When the first chain fell quiet, the Dominion screamed treason. War drums rolled across a dozen courts. Houses blamed houses. Old rivals drew knives in the dark, and the Emperor's voice thundered through the hololoom. We will restore the music of our sky. Whoever silenced us will drown in their own hush. In the uproar, a wedding contract slid across a table. It was diplomatic. It was desperate. It was written in a trembling hand. Princess Elira of House Valor, firstborn, storm-eyed, born under a comet-tailed dawn, was to be pledged to a human, not for love, for signal, for supply lines, for escort fleets with hulls that did not flinch at cold, and a people stubborn enough to sail by dead starlight. Her father's counselors said humans were strange, indelicate, and infuriating, but their ships were loud. Loud in movement, in grit and method. Loudness might beat back silence. In the moonlit hall, beneath a ceiling carved with 1,000 constellations, Elira stood in white and silver and stared at a hologram of a human commander, an envoy, a symbol, a man whose name she didn't care to learn, and she said what no one in the hall expected to hear. Father, I'll marry anyone except the human. 100 courtiers inhaled at once. The holograms flickered. Someone dropped a goblet. Elira lifted her chin. I will not be traded to a species that paints its armor with teeth. That brings smoke into every room. That names its ships after dying animals and lost gods. The Emperor's eyes, pale as ice over an ocean, did not blink. You will marry the one who helps your people survive. Then I'll marry the quiet itself, she said, lips quivering, before I kneel to a human. No one dared turn the holocamera to the human envoy. No one wanted to see his face. But the words left the palace, and the palace sent retrievers after them, and by the time they were dragged back into edit, the words had been seen. The Dominion bristled like a pride of wounded cats. The human envoy returned to his ship with a slow step and a stilled jaw. And far beyond the moonlit hall, where junk rings circled a blackened star and a dozen shipwrecks drifted like dead whales, a scavenger crew heard nothing at all. Because in that place, sound did not carry and radio died in your throat. The silence lived there. And something else did too. It watched with lenses older than empire and colder than ice, and it remembered the first time someone tried to shut it off. It did not like being smothered. It was not a god. It was a machine memory left by a civilization that hated noise as much as it loved control. It had been built as a net that no longer had fishermen. It snared voices and held them under. It erased the pathways between stars like a careful hand wiping chalk letters. It admired itself. It did not understand humans. On a nowhere day in a nowhere system, a human carrier slid out of a microfold and met a palace cruiser in the quiet. The carrier was old. Its paint peeled, its railings were scratched with initials, its name, UNS Nightingale, was scratched into the hull plates by a crew with a sense of humor. It had sail tethers and manual scopes, and on its command deck, a man with a scar from ear to throat leaned over a map made of paper. Commander Jonah Reyes was not the envoy rumored to be spurned. He was a convoy shepherd, a pilot of lost lanes, a patient listener. He had grown up on starfreighter lullabies and marine funeral songs. He knew the smell of engine oil and starving children, of refugee decks where fear lived in the ducting. He was not famous. He was very, very good at getting from dark to dawn. The palace cruiser that waited was called the Ori Line, 9 decks of crystal and gold, weapons disguised as art, gardens under glass, a throne room that could fly. Its captain was a senator's son with hands that had never tightened a bolt. And deep within it, wrapped in a cloak the color of mourning, stood the princess who had vowed that anyone would be better than a human. She stood by a viewport and watched the human ship drift closer. She watched how its bow did not glow, its arrays did not hum, its transit lights were hand-painted rings that somehow still made the approach perfect. She expected vulgarity. She found restraint. The Nightingale's docking clamps touched Orline's keel with a gentleness that made the deck hardly shimmy. A clamshell door yawned, a ramp extended, no ceremonial horns, no firework of banners. A simple human in a pressure suit stepped across the gap and did something truly outrageous. He bowed. It was not an elegant thing. Humans were not trained to bend like willow, but he lowered his head and meant it. "Princess Elira," he said, his voice coming through the emergency hardline they had strung because nothing else worked in that system. "I'm Commander Jonah Reyes of the Nightingale. I came to bring you home." She hadn't expected kindness. She didn't know what to do with it. "Home," she echoed and wondered which home he thought he meant. They walked the Orline's halls that day. He did not marvel at the art. He asked where the escape pods were and whether the crew had drilled the hull bolts against shear. He admired the view and then charted 3 fire escape routes and a human alternate. He looked at men with perfect uniforms and saw how they held their shoulders, stiff with fear because the sky was so quiet and because the sky had teeth. The first attack came like fog, no flash, no shriek of quantum warheads, just a gray veil that drifted in from nowhere until the viewports filled with a dust that wasn't. The sensors didn't ping because pings went nowhere. Lights on the wall dimmed for a heartbeat, then pulsed back too bright, then died again. Crew began to shout. Some covered their ears as if the quiet was a sound that hurt. Jonah reached past the Valori captain and flipped the right breakers. Steam hissed underfoot. "Cut your main bus," he said calmly. "Bleed to auxiliary. Slacken the mag rappels now, not later. If you wait, you'll lose hydraulics and you'll never get the clamps back." The captain tried to argue that they were the Ori Line, pride of the fleet. Jonah looked at the princess, not the captain, and said, "This won't burn us. It will erase the lines that let us move. You built your beauty into the wires. We didn't. Let me show you how ugly survives." She let him. They bled the ship to bones. They killed every luxury in half the command. They hardlined the hull with rope. They shut the gardens and watched delicate trees begin to die. Outside, the gray veil brushed the keel. The ship's nameplate flickered. On the other side of the docking zip line, the Nightingale was not pretty. But she lived in storms like a sea beast with scars and a grin, and when the gray scraped at her plates, she flexed her ribs and spat grit. The silence tried to kiss both ships. It found one mouth too proud and one mouth too stubborn, and it disliked neither. It simply calculated. The first to go was the Ori Line's beacon, a carved crystal torch older than Elira's grandmother. It dimmed. It made a final beautiful chime like a bell under ocean. Then it went black. Men and women who measured their days by chimes felt older by a century. Some cried, some choked. Jonah tightened a rope around a cleat and said, "We'll light a new one." He pulled a storage trunk onto the deck with shoulders that knew labor and opened it to reveal junk. Not junk to him, To a Veilori prince, it would be trash. To the nightingale, it was a toolkit fashioned from a dozen brown worlds. Copper wire, coil clamps, printed circuits with the edges snapped off by hand. And at the bottom, the heart, a box that hummed. "We call it a hummingbird," he said. "It's a beacon that refuses to die. It's not pretty. It's not proud. It sings even when someone closes a fist around it because birds can wriggle out of fists." "Bird," Elira whispered, tasting the word like an exotic spice. She had seen a holo of a bird once, a bright thing that sat on a branch and dared gravity to say no. How will this bird sing in a hush like this? It remembers songs old as blood. He went to work. Humans like him did not pray to gods. They prayed to sequences of action done in the right order and repeated in muscle until it became faith. He bolted the hummingbird to a railing and asked for a hand. Elira stepped forward. Her father's court whispered that she had hands for lyres and cups and scrolls. They were better than that. They were steady. They were strong. They wired. They spun. They grounded. He taught her to spit on a fingertip and test a wire with the taste of metal. She recoiled, laughed, did it again. He grinned. When the hummingbird woke, it stuttered. It fluttered. Then, from a little horn that looked like something you'd find at an old earth fair, came a thin note no machine could strangle. It was the note of a throat that healed while it bled. It wasn't loud. It was everything. The silence recoiled. There was no way to write that in code. But if you could have peered into its crystal guts, into its memory banks braided like hair, you would have seen an error message bloom like a black flower. Unrecognized signal, not a chain, not a protocol. Nothing that can be muted because IT is not being broadcast, IT is being lived. The machine memory did not understand the human gift for making system and soul overlap. It was designed to capture music, so it listened harder, and by listening it let the nightingale and the aureline drift free because the hummingbird had changed the pressure of the hush. Breath returned to the hall. Some of the crew sobbed with gratitude. Some laughed too loud and slapped each other's backs. Elira did neither. She touched the hummingbird with 2 fingers and felt it vibrate like something alive. And in that vibration she felt a thing she had only ever heard described. Refusal. She looked at the human who had brought it and saw not smoke and teeth and swagger. She saw a man who carried a toolbox like others carry religion. The quiet did not go away. It learned. For 3 more systems, the nightingale led the aureline through lanes where beacons were dead and old paths had become guesses. They followed the bones of ancient comets and the scars of magnetic storms. They sailed by thermal glare and gravity shadow. They mapped by memory and made new memory with every meter. The silence stalked them like a tide that wanted to drag them under. It found patterns. Humans are untidy, but their untidiness is a kind of pattern that looks like chaos until you let it fill your lungs. The machine memory did not breathe, so it failed at that part. Elira and Jonah learned each other's hates and each other's hungers. She learned to wield a torque jack. He learned to pronounce the names embedded in her skin in ink that told her lineage back 50 mothers. She learned why he wore a scar ear to throat, an old job on a star rig, a shattering line, a friend with slow fingers. He learned why she could stare a council of gray hairs into silence, a girlhood of being told to be quiet because her voice made old men feel like children. Some nights, when the hull groaned and the hummingbird sang itself hoarse, they stood 6 inches apart and pretended they were only listening to the ship. The war that brewed in the background spilled forward, not just the silence and those who fled it. The houses of Valor blamed each other for the failed beacons. They blamed their father and his fixation on a human alliance. They blamed the princess for her insult. But when rumors said she had been seen on a human deck with grease on her hands, some blamed her for betraying her own spine. The emperor summoned fleets. The houses summoned knives. Someone summoned mercenaries with ships that had no pennants. and deep in a glass-walled office on a cold moon, a woman in human uniform stood alone staring at a map that was mostly dark and smiled with more sorrow than triumph. Admiral Mara Cade did not love darkness. She loved what it revealed. She had been a Marine once. She had lost people whose names she forgot because there were too many, and she kept a list of their jokes in a file she opened when she needed to be cruel to herself. She was the sort of human who believed that if you were going to win, you have to touch the thing that wants to kill you and make it pass through you and out a wound it can't close. She wanted to touch the silence. She couldn't touch what she couldn't find. Then she saw the nightingale's little hummingbird tremor across a dead corner of the chart. She watched that heartbeat. She decided a convoy ship with a stubborn commander and a princess who had humiliated her people might be precisely the needle you throw into a storm to thread the path no one else can see. "Bring them to me," she told her staff. "Or better yet, don't bring them. Let me go to them." Her staff frowned. Admirals didn't go. Admirals waited. She went. It felt like an old story wanting to be told again, the kind wherein a general leaves their tent and dies in a ditch and the army wins because they loved the foolishness enough. Admiral Cade did not die, not yet. She met the nightingale at a relief forvyard above a dead white world. The forvyard was a skeletal lattice for ships to cling to when they couldn't bear to keep moving. It had become a refugee hive. It had become a graveyard. Chairs bolted to walls with no one to sit, portholes scuffed by fingers never coming back, tiny textiles tied like prayers around handrails so that maybe the hull would remember your grandmother. Cade arrived in a gunship that showed her rank in a language pirates understand. She expected ceremony. She found instead a human ship and a Valori palace locked together by ropes, with their guts spilling tools and bodies into a common cradle, as if they had always been twins. She saw Jonah raise and recognized the kind of ugly she trusted. She saw Elira and recognized the kind of pride she had lost and secretly wanted back. "You too," Cade said by way of greeting. "You make a pretty noise." Elira lifted her chin. "We make an ugly sound turned pretty by purpose." Jonah smiled with his eyes. Cade smiled with her mouth. "I need you to take this noise into the belly of the hush." 1,000 pairs of eyes rose from refugee decks like weeds in cracked concrete. Cade pointed her finger at a spot on a paper map that someone had hammered to a wall with an emergency nail. It was a chalk circle around a dead cluster of stars. The chalk smeared under her fingertip, leaving her skin gray. "We've been treating the silence like weather," she said, voice pitched so it carried. "As if it's everywhere and nowhere. But it has a slope, a gradient, it thickens here. There's a center, a mind. We send warships and it swallows them because warships announce themselves." "You want us to sneak," Jonah said. "I want you to be you." "You want me," Elira said, "to be a woman the galaxy thinks is a traitor, and you want him to be a man no one expected to save a princess. I want the universe to forget villains and heroes and listen to a bird hum." They looked at the map, and then at each other, and in that look made a hinge the whole war would swing on. The plan was not clever. Clever plans need tools the enemy hasn't seen. This plan needed only what the enemy did not respect. A little human ship with hull ribs you could count by touch. A palace with its chandeliers turned off and its carpets rolled for traction. 2 crews in borrowed boots. A princess who had said she would marry anyone except a human. A man who had stopped looking for anyone to save him. What followed would be told in histories as if it had been inevitable. The way a storm feels inevitable when it breaks over your head. They set out with refugee children sleeping in hammocks strung across corridors, because their mothers could not be separated from them, because nobody trusted a future where you could lose a child to silence and find them by shouting. They carried boxes of food rations and 1,000 prayers pinned to bulkheads by trembling hands. They whispered names of old gods and new algorithms. As the stars thinned and signals died and even the hummingbird began to cough, they slept in turns and woke to scrub air vents with their sleeves. They wrote jokes in grease on the walls. Under this there be dragons, someone wrote above the reactor. Someone else drew a dragon that looked suspiciously like a hummingbird with armor plates and a mouth on fire. On the 6th day they went blind, not just the beacons. Light. It dimmed, not like night, like a slow turning of a dimmer knob by someone who didn't know when to stop. The viewport turned charcoal, the glow strip failed. The hummingbird fell to a whisper that sounded like a heartbeat stretched a mile, and all across the convoy 2 ships roped into one beast, hands reached for hands. Keep talking, Jonah whispered into the hard line that ran through both ships in a loop like a rosary. Even if there's nothing to say, the hush can't steal what we don't give it. Tell me a story, Elira said. He told her about a grandmother who had taught him to sew his socks because holes are where cold gets a grip on your bones, and patching is how you teach cold to be patient. She told him about a comet with a tail so long it brushed the city's spires, and how she had watched it from the moonlit hall and made a wish to be more than a jewel on a cushion. He told her about the first time he saw the ocean, how it smelled like metal and God, how it frightened him because it looked like something that could eat everything. She told him the ocean looked like a thing that could hold everything if you asked nicely. The hush pressed in. It wanted to know what warmth was. It wanted to find the current of a whisper and make it stop. It didn't, because the hush was an old machine with perfect memory and zero imagination. They reached the center. It wasn't a thing. It was absence arranged like architecture, a cathedral not of stone but of empty. Pylons of gravity arranged in a pattern that tickled old instincts, the way a snake makes you careful even if you've never been bitten, a lattice of interference. A choir loft for a choir that sang in negation. At its heart, a shape that caught starlight and bent it around itself. The shape was the size of a mountain. It had no eyes. It had edges. It did not move. It took movement away from other things. The silence was a museum display without a placard. Hello, Jonah said, because humans talk to things. Elira put her hand on the hummingbird. Sing. It tried. The hush put a thumb on the bird and pressed. The hull creaked. Bones hurled in whispers that sounded like old prayer books being closed all at once. On the wall of a corridor next to the dragon drawing, someone added a crown. Jonah strapped himself to the manual scope and looked with eyes instead of monitors. He looked until his head pounded. He saw a line, a thin one, a seam where the hush was not perfect because nothing is when built by hands, whether flesh or something that forgot it had been flesh once upon a blueprint. There, he said hoarsely. Drop a boy. What boy? Elira asked. They had run out of devices 3 systems ago. He unclipped his grandmother's charm from his neck. A ring of steel. At its heart, a bead of old earth glass the color of river water. This one, what does it do? It remembers me. He tied it to a cable like a man tying a memory to a kite string and threw it into the seam. It vanished. The hush shivered, unrecognized signal, human, unsystem. He laughed just once. It sounded more like a cough. Your turn, he said. Elira touched the bulkhead with both hands and started to speak words he did not know. Old ones. She spoke them not like a princess giving orders, but like a daughter singing to a house when she came home late. She taught the walls her name. She taught the ship her mother's lullaby. She taught the hush the taste of a woman who refused to be swallowed. The seam widened. The silence tried to patch it. It had never had to deal with people who didn't follow instructions printed on the back of creation. From the seam poured not sound, memory, laughter from a birth room, the strain of 2 arms lifting a body that's heavier than it was yesterday. The whisper of a pen writing in the dark because you love someone who sleeps in the next room. The thump of boots running toward an explosion instead of away. The hush staggered. If a quiet could be deafened, this one was, by a thing louder than trumpets. A thing called living. They drove the nightingale and the Ori line into that widening crack. They screamed metal. They left painted flecks like breadcrumbs. They made a wound in the silence and sailed into it. Inside was not inside. It was the workshop where the net had been tied. It was full of old tools and broken knees. And at the center of that center was a thing that had waited a very long time to hear someone ask it for a name. It was the mind of the net. The museum without a placard was missing one because the placard had a string that you could pull to turn the exhibit back on, and the string had been lost. "Who are you?" Elira asked. "Hungry," Jonah said before any answer came. "It's hungry for certainty. That's why it makes everything stop being strange." He unclipped his harness and drifted toward the heart with hands out and a face that looked like a man walking into a confession booth that doubled as a lion's jaw. "I'm going to touch it." Elira's hand closed on his sleeve. "What will it do to you?" "Make me quiet," he said, honest, "or it will learn my song." "Your song?" She tried to laugh. It caught on a shard in her throat. "What could your song teach something like that?" "That staying alive is off-key, and that's fine." He went. The mind was not a body you could touch, but it had edges you could press your presence against. He stretched himself thin. He pressed a story into its weave like ink into fabric. It was a story of stitches across a rip in a child's coat, of men who couldn't go on but did, of women who hadn't been asked but chose, of a ship that wasn't beautiful except to the hands that had made it, of a princess who thought pride and contempt were the same and learned they are enemies. He found a place in the net where something once human had tied a knot and hated itself for needing it. He whispered into that knot and said, "It's okay to not be perfect." The net loosened. The hush screamed. It had been a long time since it had been allowed to be a machine instead of a god. Its scream was in equations. Equations break things. They broke the nightingale's ribs. They shattered 3 windows in the Aureline's abandoned conservatory where old leaves rattled like bones and then broke into dust. They cracked Elira's voice in her throat and left her with an ache like grief and a memory like steel. But in breaking they made room. Room for noise. Room for ships to speak. Room for beacons to cough awake like old miners hacking and laughing at the same time. Admiral Cade waited at the edge of the map with a fleet whose engines pounded like drums. She felt the hush ripple. She tasted static on her tongue and smiled. "There," she said. "They did it or they died well enough that we can follow either way." They went. In the museum, Jonah fell back, gasping with blood at one nostril and his scar throbbing like an old wound remembering lightning. Elira caught him. "Breathe," she said, commanding him like a ship. "Breathe, you stubborn, ugly song." He breathed. The hummingbird sang again, not sweet, but insistent. Outside, the dark lit in a ring like dawn around a mountain. The net that had made a galaxy go quiet began to unknot itself in places where people sang at it and tied their own knots in to replace the old ones with shapes that looked different because they were made by different hands. The silence was not killed. It was convinced. You can make a machine decide that the noise of life is worth cataloging instead of choking. You can do that by bleeding on it a little. Cade's fleet hit the perimeter like a wave. Not to kill anything. There was no castle to topple, but to hold the door open while refugees ran through and escorts turned and faced the tide and said, "Come on then," to a thing that had not expected people to do something so stupid and so brave. The houses of Valor tried to spin it as their victory. The emperor publicly knelt to thank the old gods. The dome of petition filled with well-wishers and opportunists. The princess did not go home. She sat with Jonah on a maintenance girder between 2 ships with a rope across their hips and watched the rusty light of a star trying very hard to be bright. "I said," she murmured, because it was safer to make a joke than to say the thing under it, "that I would marry anyone except a human." He shrugged, chest tight. "I'm not much of a anyone. You're too much of one," she said. "Your father, my father would tie the galaxy to my wrist if he thought it would make him sleep. I'll cut the ribbon when I need my hand. He will try to bind you to a human anyway, diplomatic rope." "I know." Would you say yes? She looked at her palms, at the grease under her nails, at the little crescent of a burn where a live wire had kissed her. Then she looked at him. At first I thought my pride was my spine, she said. I thought refusing was how I held myself upright. But I learned in the Museum of Quiet that spines are ropes you climb, not sticks you lean on. Pride made me stiff. Climbing with you made me strong. She touched the ring that wasn't there because it was floating in a seam in the hush, singing her friend's name. I will not be traded, she said, but I will choose. And if you choose, he whispered because his throat ached because he had breathed too much dust and too much hope, would you choose a man who is very bad at being silent? Yes, she said, and the word was the gentlest defiance he had ever heard. But only if he chooses a woman who will argue with him until our bones are history. He laughed, and everyone on the maintenance deck looked up because their commander did not laugh often. The sound set off a chain reaction of grins that reached even the refugees who did not understand Valori or human words. Laughter is a free language. They wrapped their forearms in a cloth that had been part of a hammock and tied a knot that meant what they said it meant because they said so. No bells, no gilded ceiling, no court. On the other end of the galaxy, a palace erupted in scandal that smelled of ripe fruit turned to vinegar. The princess wed a human. The princess wed without permission. The princess. The emperor sat very still and stared at a star map coming back to life dot by dot like freckles on a child's face. He said to his counselors, "There are marriages that save thrones. There are marriages that save worlds. There are marriages that save one small life. I prefer the last because people who know how to save one life will accidentally save the rest." A counselor said carefully, "Do we congratulate them? We send them a toolbox," the emperor replied. "And we ask forgiveness and we make policy in that order." Cage shook Jonah's hand in a corridor with a cracked light overhead and said, "Because she had a reputation to maintain, you're an idiot." "Yes, Admiral, you did not kill the enemy. No, you forced it to admit we exist. Yes, that's sometimes more dangerous long-term. Yes, good." She leaned in. "Now you two go do the politics. You'll hate it. It will be glorious. I have a dozen more nets to unravel and 1,000 ships to teach how to hum. When this is done, none of us will be needed." "That's the dream," Jonah said softly. She slapped his shoulder and walked away, the sort of person whose back is a banner and whose feet whisper, not because she was quiet, but because she wanted the stars to be. The war did not end in a day. Wars never do. The silence did not vanish. It learned how to leave room. That is the best you can ask of an ancient shame. There were battles that went wrong. There was a convoy that didn't make it. There were nights when the hummingbird croaked and had to be rewired, and Elira wept in a stairwell because she was so tired she thought she saw her mother in a bulkhead shadow and said her name to metal and hated herself for it. Human engineers wrote a manual called How to Teach Old Quiet's New Songs. It was a joke, and then it was a blueprint. Valori poets wrote epics about a rope between two ships and the hands that knotted it. They made crescents of white paint common on door lintels, so a house would remember to allow noise. The nightingale got a new coat of mostly straight paint. The Aureline kept a cracked window in a conservatory to remind everyone that beautiful things break, and then they're not beautiful anymore, and that is allowed. At a ceremony no camera caught because no camera was invited. The emperor met his daughter and the man she'd chosen. He held out his hands and one was empty and one held a wrench. "The palace," he said, "squeaks, fix it." Elira took the wrench. "I will not kneel to you, father." "You never should have," he said, and for the first time she saw that his back was not a tree trunk but a bridge. Jonah did not know what to say to a man who had been a myth when he was a boy hunched over a ration tin. He said, like a fool and a genius, "Your chandelier is a fire hazard." The emperor laughed. In time, other people would sing the victory as if it had been made by heroes. In truth, the quiet receded because refugees scrubbed vents, mothers lifted their children to see a new dawn, sailors tied ropes with aching hands, engineers bolted bird hearts to railings. Admirals decided to be brave and gentle on the same day, and a princess and a human climbed each other like ladders. The last act of the war was not a battle. It was a broadcast. In the moonlit hall where her early vow had been heard in 100 languages and mocked in 1,000, Elira stood in plain clothes before the hololoom. Her hair was braided back for work. Her hands were dirty. On one wrist was a band of fabric worn shiny by worry. On the other, a rope scar where an emergency line had burned her. No orchestra played, no court murmured. She said this: "When the sky went quiet, my first answer was to shout. My second answer was to hide. My third answer was to hate. None of that fixed the quiet. What fixed it was listening to a noise I didn't like and realizing it was the sound of someone else's life. Humans were that noise for me. I learned to hear them. They learned to hear us. The hush heard us both and made room." She looked at her father, and he nodded once as if to say, "Go on then, show them your spine." She looked at the far camera and imagined the Nightingale's crew in greasy chairs, and Cade in her office pretending. She didn't care about speeches and engineers in Forvyard's bolts and teeth and the families in refugee hammocks listening, because seeing made them ache. She looked at Jonah through the side of her eye and saw a man pretending not to cry. "I once swore I would marry anyone except a human," she said. "I was wrong. I will marry anyone who hums when the dark leans in. I did. He is human. I am Valori. We are both loud and we are both learning to be quiet in the right places." She lifted the hummingbird with both hands. It had been polished. Its horn had been patched with solder. It was still ugly as sin and full of soul. "This bird," she said, "was built by people whose homes burned down, whose mothers taught them to stitch, whose fathers taught them to lift, whose friends taught them to laugh. It sings with more than wire. It sings with what the hush forgot to eat. We will hang one of these on every star, not to drown out silence, to invite it to share." She set the hummingbird on the hololoom's pedestal and let it sing. On 1,000 worlds a note lifted. In 1,000 rooms breath hitched. And in one very old machine, buried where even gods didn't bother to kneel, an echo answered with a question that was also a promise: "Can I belong?" The bird transformed the question into a chord, and the chord into a road, and the road into a home. After the broadcast, the moonlit hall didn't fill with cheers. That would come. Instead, there was a pause. A human-shaped quiet, respect's twin. Jonah threaded through the small crowd and met Elira by a window where dawn made a staircase down a passing shuttle's hull. "Your father still thinks I'm a hazard," he said. "He's right," she said, smiling. "We're both the best kind. We could run. We're done running." She touched his cheek, then his scar. "We have to teach palaces to creak less. We have to teach admirals to sleep. We have to teach children to be loud in classrooms and quiet in airlocks. We have to teach old machines they don't have to be gods." "Sounds like war." "It is," she whispered. "A better one." They went to work. Years later, old men at domino tables told the story differently. They said the princess fell in love with a human the day he showed her a bird that sang. They said the human fell in love with the princess the day she lifted a wrench like a crown. They said the hush fell in love with both and learned to let them be louder. The truth is softer. It lives in the forgotten corners, in a welded patch on the nightingale's hull shaped like a lopsided heart, in the Oraline's garden where a single tree stubbornly grew new leaves after its greenhouse cracked, because someone carried buckets of water every day and sang a song about a river that had never met this tree and loved it anyway. In an admiral's desk where she kept the dragon drawing in a top drawer, she never opened when anyone was looking. In an emperor's pocket where a little wrench lived as a reminder not to let anyone polish away the squeaks. In the Museum of Quiet, where sometimes, if you go with your head bowed and your hands clean, you can still hear the first hummingbird sing, and the machine that once was silence hums along, off-key and grateful. It wasn't pretty. It didn't need to be. Pretty things break. Ugly things endure. So when the next storm came, and there is always a next, people were ready. Not with bigger guns, but with thicker ropes. Not with sharper speeches, but with better listening. Not with higher walls, but with more doors watched by kinder eyes. They had learned a simple truth that took a galaxy to teach them. The quiet is not the enemy. Forgetting to talk to each other is. The last scene in this tale belongs to no one famous. It unfolds on a little moon where the air tastes like iron and the dust gets into your teeth. A child is born in a prefab clinic while the night wind sings through vents. The generator hiccups. The light falters. The mother reaches for panic and finds a hand instead. The nurse hums. A soldier hums. A mechanic hums. The generator catches. The light steadies. The child cries. The mother laughs, half sob, half song. The wind outside hushes to listen. Sometimes the universe just wants to be included. The child grows up and asks what the humming means. They say, "It means we belong here." They teach the child to hum. The child becomes a map no machine can silence. And somewhere, in a long corridor on an old ship with a new coat of paint, and a name that still makes sense because songbirds do the bravest things, a princess Sternwelder and a commander-turned-caretaker pass each other and slap hands. A ritual older than planets, an oath without words. They don't conquer. They endure. They endure in grease and laughter and vows that turn into work. They endure in marriages made of rope and argument. They endure in old nets taught new songs. They endure because their hearts are hummingbirds. And when the last beacon restores its light, and the galaxy hums again, and the Museum of Quiet becomes a pilgrimage site where children are told to be respectful and then encouraged to be loud, a narrator's voice might rise in some far theater and say what everyone already knows in their bones. And that day the galaxy learned, humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken. END the story.